when to use a deload block versus a pivot block. First, let's start with some definitions. A deload is simply a period of training with minimal changes outside of volume and or intensity. That means we may reduce the total training sets, reduce the training days per week, or reduce the absolute intensity which the lifter may experience within any training session. A deload can last as long as you need it to, but the main difference between a deload block and a pivot block is that the exercise selection is maintained throughout the deload block and is quite similar to what the athlete may normally experience. On the other hand, a pivot block is when an athlete changes most things in their training to experience some combination of novelty, a higher level of motivation, enjoyment, a reduction of training stress, a different type of training stress. Ultimately, a pivot block is when the athlete pivots and reduces their training stress. So they pivot their training entirely, reduce their training stress, and then they come back to their normal training later on. So both a deload block and a pivot block provide similar benefits, though the nuances or the differences between them are important. Let's talk about when you should deload. The main reason to implement a deload block is when your training stress surpasses your ability to recover from that training stress. And as a result, you experience reductions in strength expression, higher levels of joint and tendon sensitivity, pain, and or a decrease in motivation as a result of these sensations that occur when you're basically training too much. As powerlifters, our main priority is to increase our strength in the squat, bench press, and deadlift. And high training stress, as you may hear, high fatigue, usually hinders our ability to express strength. Before you decide to deload, it's important to think about what is impacting or preventing you from recovering. Ask yourself questions like, am I getting at least 8 hours of quality sleep per night? Am I accurate with my RPE? Am I hitting the desired training stimulus that my coach or that I wrote myself? Am I eating sufficient amounts of protein to provide my body with enough calories and the amino acids to repair and recover from my recent training stimuli? One variable that greatly impacts your ability to recover is your work stress. A lot of people don't think as work stress is something that could impact their training, but just think about how much mental energy you're putting into the work that you do throughout your day and what the work that you do actually entails. For example, if you're sitting all day and then you train 2 to 3 times a week for about 2 hours a day, yes, that's incredible, but just think about how many hours a day you're not training. You're not moving your body in a way that's productive or similar to the competition movements. So if you're not getting up a lot and your work is really stressful and you use a lot of your creative and emotional energy towards work, then it might make sense that you're having a tough time with training because you've used a good amount of your energy and your recovery capacity for work. And if you see where I'm going with this, it's that we have these external stressors and internal stressors that add up to what we're calling stress. So if your stress is too high and your recovery is too low and you're not seeing the progress that you'd like to see, it might benefit you to deload. Pull your training stress back. See what happens. You might realize that the deload stress is actually a better overall stress for you, and you simply reduce your volume and then you keep the volume low for a longer period of time until perhaps your life stressors change and you can handle and actually recover from more volume and more training stimuli. What about a pivot block? When would we implement a pivot block? If you really enjoy all the movements and the exercises and the rep ranges in your training, then a pivot block would not make sense because, as I mentioned before, a pivot block is when you change pretty much everything in your training to get you some novel experiences, new energy systems being trained, and just a completely different approach to training. However, if you're starting to feel less motivated for the main movements in your program, then a pivot might be exactly what you need. Like I said, a pivot allows us to shift towards new movements. So if you normally squat, maybe you switch to a leg press. If you're normally benching a lot, maybe you switch to some cable flies. Or you experiment with other machines in your gym that you haven't ever used before and you would like to experiment with. And that might provide you with the novelty that you need, but it's also important that if your stress is still too high, a pivot won't solve anything fundamentally. So we may want to pivot and reduce the overall training stress, i.e. the volume and the RPE, while thinking about why our recovery is suffering. Now, I want to talk about a third strategy that might be better than deloading and pivoting, and that is auto-regulating your volume and your training stress on a daily or a weekly basis to account for the accumulation of fatigue and stress from both training and work, while preventing you from ever experiencing that insanely high level of fatigue that forces you to make a decision about a deload or a pivot. For example, to help athletes auto-regulate their volume and their stress, I like to give my athletes a set range and a rep range while keeping the RPE constant. The more training variables that you manipulate, the more noise that may occur in the analysis. However, I'm less concerned with the noise in the analysis or in the data, and I'm more concerned with my athletes progressing. Let me provide you with an example of how my athletes auto-regulate their training stress. For one of my athletes with their squat, I have them perform a triple at an RPE 8. This is called our benchmark set. This allows the athlete to understand their ability to express strength on any given day. It also provides a consistent stimulus for us to reference from Monday week 1 to Monday week 2, or whenever they end up squatting. However, the top set is not typically where most athletes' progress comes from. It's not usually driving strength adaptations. It is simply allowing us to express strength on the day. What I found is that back off sets are where we get a lot of these strength adaptations. It's where we actually build strength. So typically I have this athlete perform sets of 5 to 7 repetitions at 75 to 80% of their estimated max for the day, which we can derive from that top benchmarking set. And then we provide them with an RPE target, let's say RPE 8. So the percentage is variable, the repetitions are variable, but the RPE is constant. And allows them to think in the moment how each repetition feels and whether or not another repetition will be nourishing. As I said, these back off sets are what create a lot of the strength development and the hypertrophic enhancements that will provide long-term progress. So as long as they get at least one hard set in their back offs, we can assume that 1, that's not going to be their last set for the rest of their lives, and 2, they have another similar session later on in the week or later in the next week. So we focus on momentum and adjusting the stress according to their daily recovery ability and what feels nourishing for the day. That allows for a non-linear rate of progression, but that prevents us from deloading, and it also prevents the athlete from having high levels of fatigue frequently throughout their training, and instead we can find a more appropriate training stress for each training session. So I hope that makes sense. Deloads are useful when you're unable to control the training stress and you just want to keep the exercises that you're used to while reducing the overall training volume for a few weeks. 1 to 3 weeks usually. Pivots are when the athlete is not really enjoying training, they don't like the movements or the rep ranges, and you want to completely give them something new protocols, new exercises, maybe you have them do some cardio as well. However, my preferred strategy for stress management for my athletes is through auto-regulating their volume of mechanical tension and intensity. If you have questions about how to auto-regulate your training volume and your training stress, let me know in the comments down below. I have a free program you can download as well at my website at www.zaustrength.com, and I will see you in the next one.